I won't say the name of the person who tweeted this, but to paraphrase, is that, these books are old and they're sort of falling out of fashion, which by the way is totally in dispute, but this is the supposition that they're falling out of fashion for a reason, which is that, we should be reading more contemporary texts, or we should be reading subjects that are refinements of philosophy, right? Like, in a way, natural science, political science, economics, these all spring from philosophy. This is something that you talked about at length with Alexander Dugin in your interview with him, about how philosophy is sort of the root of all of the other subjects. And so I wanted to ask you, is Western philosophy dead or alive?
Well, it's not a straightforward question for me. And so here's how I start to think about a question like that. Okay. Dugin has a book, his second Heidegger book. It's called Martin Heidegger, The Possibility of Russian Philosophy. And he says in that book that for liberals, there's no such thing as Russian philosophy. There's just philosophy, because philosophy is a human activity and humans are humans. They're not like segregated into peoples and races in any essential or fundamental sense. What's important is the underlying universal human dimension. So for liberals, Russian philosophy is, it doesn't even make sense to say that. Philosophy is just philosophy. For nationalists, he says, and for conservatives, Russian philosophy is a fact. He says, because it's like they take for granted the existence of a uniquely Russian tradition of thinking, one that is non-Western, since part of what it is to identify as a Russian nationalist or Russian conservative is to identify yourself in opposition to the West. So that's, for them, it's like an established fact. What really attracted me to Dugin's book, among other things, is that for him, it's a question. He says both the liberals and the nationalists / conservatives, they're failing to see that it's an open question, the possibility of Russian philosophy, which first you'd have to even identify, what does it mean for philosophy to be or not to be Russian? Okay, so similarly with the question of Western philosophy, what does it mean for philosophy to be or not to be Western? So something that I teach a lot, and again, I have to give credit here to Dugin, because it's Dugin's version of Heidegger, Dugin's presentation of Heidegger, that put a certain set of Heidegger's books front and center for me in a way that other presentations of Heidegger didn't. So the one that I have at the top of my book pile right here, Contributions to Philosophy of the Event, which I teach in the school, and which, besides Plato's Republic, is probably my most annotated book at the moment and over the last 10 years. So if you take this as an example, Contributions to Philosophy of the Event, Heidegger says Western philosophy has come to an end, but it's in a transitional moment. It's on a transition towards another beginning of philosophy. And Heidegger himself is the figure who inaugurates both the transition and the another inception. And in my view, he's got a very compelling statement of that whole dynamic. So for him, Western philosophy is the quote unquote episode between Plato and Nietzsche. The transition is reflecting on the meaning of that episode, the meaning of that history. And the other beginning of philosophy is seeing what was left out of the first beginning and appropriating it thoughtfully in a new speaking, roughly. That probably wouldn't be totally clear to everybody, but it doesn't matter. So the point there is that he has a well-defined beginning, middle, and end to Western philosophy, as well as a future for philosophy. Left Heideggerians, in my view, took over his model of a beginning, middle, end of philosophy, but they stopped at the end of philosophy. So all of their thinking and working is working within the end and at the end of philosophy. They don't have the figure of another beginning like he has. Whereas Dugin is somebody who incorporated into his own work Heidegger's notion of another beginning of philosophy. And then sort of adjacent to the dispute over the re-inception of philosophy in Heidegger, you also have people like Strauss, Leo Strauss, as someone who's so important to me, equally important to me as is Heidegger, equally important to the pedagogy of the school and all the rest of it. And Strauss sort of doesn't map onto that fully because he rejects the premise of a beginning and middle and end to philosophy, since he doesn't think that philosophy is primarily historical, whereas for Heidegger, philosophy is primarily historical. So I would say that your your question about whether there's, the status of Western philosophy today, it's an open, it can be the kind of question that allows us to think philosophically about the meaning of thinking, the relationship of being and time, of thinking, being and time, and all of these things. Because suddenly it allows us to put Heidegger, left and right interpretations of Heidegger, non-Heideggerian thought all on the table, and then to recognize that we're faced with a problem here that we're barely equipped to even work through. And that invites us hopefully to go deeper into it. And in doing so, we keep philosophy alive. Philosophy, the life of philosophy depends on there being people who put the question above everything else. Because to philosophize, I think this is accurately stated in Heidegger and other thinkers that I admire. Questioning is the driving force in philosophy. Questioning moves you deeper and deeper into domains that you haven't yet mastered. But as Heidegger puts it, they're concealed and nevertheless compelling. So we haven't mastered them, but they're not trivial. In exposing ourselves to them through questioning, they exert a kind of hold on us. And that, whether you call that being struck by wonder or whether you call it something else, that hold that the realm of the questionable has on us, it's the kind of thing that it doesn't leave you alone somehow. It's always there with you for the rest of your life. And it's the basic element of a philosophical conversion. So I would also put it this way. I mean, I could point to my table and say, my pen is there, my cup is there, my books are there. But Western philosophy, or philosophy as such, thinking as such, it's not just something you can point to and say it's there or it's not there. It's alive when our questioning is alive. It's alive when our thinking is alive. So we don't have to say it's alive only when there's a well-acknowledged tradition that's in place and easily identifiable. Philosophy lives when we expose ourselves to the questions that constitute it, that realm of the concealed and nevertheless compelling. So I would say in that sense, yes, I mean, enough people I have seen with my own eyes and spoke to on my own, directly, who are drawn into understanding what is it to be? What is it to be human? What is it to be a people? What is, these fundamental questions, which they very crucially, they don't just treat as some automatic, it's not just rote. We could go through a bunch of quote unquote philosophical questions and treat them routinely and state them like automatically, like just going through the motions. But there are still people for whom a lot is at stake and they're willing to put themselves at stake. And if you have that, then you have philosophy.